Most people think the story of America begins with Columbus in 1492. 3 small ships crossing the Atlantic, a discovery that connected Europe and the New World. It's the version taught in classrooms, printed in textbooks, and repeated so often that it feels unquestionable. But 500 years before Columbus ever sailed, another group of Europeans had already reached North America. They built houses there. They repaired ships there. They cut timber, gathered resources, explored coastlines, and attempted to establish a permanent settlement. And then they disappeared. For nearly 1,000 years, their story drifted somewhere between legend and myth. Historians dismissed it. Scholars argued over it. Many people assumed it never happened at all. Yet today, we know it was real. The Vikings reached North America around the year 1000 AD. The Norse called it Vinland. And the story of why Vinland failed reveals something far more interesting than a simple tale of exploration. It reveals how economics, geography, politics, and memory itself determine which civilizations are remembered and which are forgotten. To understand Vinland, you have to begin not in America but in Greenland. Around 985 AD, a Viking explorer named Eric the Red established settlements on Greenland's southwestern coast after being exiled from Iceland for murder. The name Greenland was likely a marketing strategy. According to medieval sources, Eric believed settlers would be more willing to move there if the land sounded attractive, and he needed settlers. The Greenland colonies existed on the edge of survival. The climate was harsh. Arable land was limited. Wood was scarce. The population never exceeded a few thousand people. Yet despite these disadvantages, Greenland occupied a valuable position in the medieval economy. Europe desperately wanted walrus ivory. Before elephant ivory became widely available, walrus tusks were one of the most valuable luxury commodities in Northern Europe. Greenland possessed them in abundance. For centuries, Greenland's economy depended heavily on exporting walrus products to Europe. This is important because Vikings were not primarily explorers in the modern sense. They were traders, merchants, resource seekers. Economic opportunities drove most long-distance Viking expansion. The raids that made them famous often had financial motivations. The settlements they established from Ireland to Russia were built around trade networks. When Vikings sailed west, they weren't searching for adventure. They were searching for wealth. And that search eventually carried them beyond Greenland. The first glimpse came accidentally. According to the Icelandic sagas, a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson was blown off course while attempting to reach Greenland. Instead of finding his destination, he sighted unknown lands farther west. He never went ashore, but he reported what he had seen. Years later, another explorer became interested, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red. Around the year 1000, Leif purchased Bjarni's ship and set out to investigate these mysterious lands. According to the sagas, he encountered 3 regions: Helluland, likely modern Baffin Island, a rocky barren landscape, then Markland, probably Labrador, rich in forests, and finally Vinland, a milder region with abundant resources. Exactly where Vinland was located remained a mystery for centuries, but the archaeological evidence eventually pointed toward Newfoundland in eastern Canada. For Greenlanders, this discovery was extraordinary. Remember the biggest weakness of Greenland: wood. Trees barely grew there. Timber was one of the most valuable resources a Norse colony could obtain. Ships required it. Buildings required it. Tools required it. A land covered in forests represented enormous economic potential. The traditional image of Vikings portrays fearless warriors seeking conquest. The reality appears far less dramatic. Vinland was probably conceived primarily as a resource extraction project, an overseas economic venture, something closer to a medieval business expedition than a military campaign. The Norse established a settlement. They built turf houses, workshops, storage facilities. Evidence suggests ship repair operations, iron production, resource processing. These were not random visitors. They came intending to stay, at least temporarily. In 1960, Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad discovered the remains of a Norse settlement at Meadows in Newfoundland. The discovery transformed history. For the first time, Physical evidence confirmed that Europeans had reached North America centuries before Columbus. The site contained unmistakably Norse architecture, ironworking facilities, artifacts matching medieval Scandinavian culture. Radiocarbon dating aligned closely with saga accounts. The legends were real, yet something strange happened. Despite reaching North America first, the Vikings failed. Why? The answer begins with simple mathematics. Greenland's population was tiny. At its peak, perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 people. That's not much larger than a modern village. Establishing a successful overseas colony requires people. Lots of people. Farmers, builders, craftsmen, families, workers. The Norse simply didn't possess the demographic resources necessary to sustain a distant settlement across thousands of kilometers of ocean. Every colonist sent to Vinland weakened Greenland. Every expedition consumed scarce manpower, and unlike later European empires, the Norse had no large state backing them. No king funding massive settlements, no centralized bureaucracy, no empire directing colonization efforts. Vinland existed because individual leaders believed it might be profitable. Once profitability became uncertain, enthusiasm disappeared quickly. Then there was the issue of distance. Even today, Newfoundland is remote. In the medieval world, it was unimaginably isolated. Communication with Greenland required dangerous ocean voyages. Communication with Europe required even more. Supply lines were fragile. Support was inconsistent. A bad season could cut off contact entirely. Colonies survive through connection. Vinland never achieved that. But geography alone wasn't the decisive factor. The real challenge came from the people already living there. The Norse sagas describe encounters with indigenous populations they called Skrælings. The term was not an ethnic name but a general Norse label for the native peoples they encountered. Exactly which groups they met remains debated. Likely ancestors of indigenous peoples living in northeastern North America. At first, trade appears to have occurred. The sagas describe exchanges of goods, textiles, metal objects, animal products, but trade quickly gave way to tension. Then violence. The details are difficult to verify because the surviving accounts were written centuries after the events, yet the broader pattern is familiar throughout history. Small foreign settlements attempting to establish themselves within territories already occupied by larger local populations often face overwhelming challenges. The Norse possessed technological advantages in some areas, iron tools, ocean-going ships, military equipment, but they were vastly outnumbered. A few dozen settlers could not dominate an entire region. Unlike later colonial powers, they lacked the manpower necessary to impose control. Every conflict carried enormous risk. One disastrous encounter could destroy the colony entirely. The economics also proved disappointing. Vinland offered timber, perhaps furs, possibly other resources, but transporting those goods back to Greenland and then onward to Europe was expensive. The profit margins may never have justified the risks involved. This is a point often overlooked. Exploration succeeds when economic incentives outweigh costs. The Vikings reached North America, but reaching somewhere and making money there are two very different things. For Vinland, the numbers may simply never have worked. Over time, the settlement was abandoned. Expeditions became less frequent. Trade diminished. The connection faded, and eventually the colony disappeared altogether. Yet the most fascinating part of the story comes after Vinland ended, because failure alone doesn't explain why the world forgot it. Many failed colonies remain well documented. Many abandoned settlements survive in historical memory. Vinland merely vanished. Why? Part of the answer lies in medieval record-keeping. The Norse did not leave extensive written documentation. Most information survived through oral tradition, stories passed between generations, eventually written down centuries later in Icelandic sagas. Those sagas mixed history with storytelling, fact with embellishment, memory with legend. As a result, later scholars often doubted them. The evidence seemed too thin, the claims too extraordinary. 1,000 years ago, Europeans crossed the Atlantic. Many historians simply refused to believe it. Then there was another problem. History tends to remember winners. Successful colonies generate documents, governments, institutions, cities, archives. Vinland produced none of these. No lasting kingdom, no permanent settlements, no enduring political structures, nothing that connected medieval North America to later European expansion. When Columbus arrived centuries later, he unknowingly entered a continent whose earlier Norse visitors had left almost no visible trace. The chain of memory had broken, and once broken, it remained broken for generations. There's also a deeper reason. The discovery of Vinland challenged powerful historical narratives. For centuries, European history emphasized Columbus as the beginning of transatlantic contact. National identities formed around that story. Educational systems reinforced it. Public memory embraced it. Acknowledging Viking exploration didn't erase Columbus's importance, but it complicated the narrative. History often prefers simple stories. Reality rarely provides them. The truth is that Columbus changed world history because his voyages created permanent connections between continents. The Vikings did not. Leif Erikson reached North America first. Columbus transformed it. Those are different achievements. Yet because one succeeded where the other failed, one became globally famous while the other faded into obscurity. The archaeological rediscovery of Vinland changed that. Meadows provided something legends alone never could. Physical proof. Once the site was excavated, skepticism became increasingly difficult to maintain. The settlement's architecture matched Greenland and Iceland. The artifacts matched Norse culture. The dates matched the sagas. A forgotten chapter of history suddenly re-emerged. What makes Vinland so compelling is that it reveals how fragile historical memory can be. We often imagine major events permanently shaping collective knowledge. But that's not always true. Entire societies can disappear. Trade routes can vanish. Technologies can be forgotten. Discoveries can be lost. The Vikings reached North America around 5 centuries before Columbus. Then the knowledge largely vanished from Europe, not because it was false, because the institutions capable of preserving and spreading that knowledge never existed. In the end, Vinland wasn't erased by conspiracy. It wasn't hidden by governments. It wasn't deliberately removed from history. It was buried by failure. A small colony on the edge of the known world couldn't sustain itself economically. It couldn't overcome demographic weakness. It couldn't maintain secure relations with surrounding populations. It couldn't generate enough profit to justify permanent investment. And because it failed, it left almost no descendants to tell its story. That's the lesson of Vinland. It's shaped by who stays, who builds, who connects distant places into lasting systems. The Vikings crossed an ocean that many believed uncrossable. They reached a continent unknown to medieval Europe. For a brief moment, they stood at the edge of a new world. Then they left. And for nearly 1,000 years, the world forgot they had ever been there. Until archaeology uncovered the evidence hidden beneath the grass of Newfoundland and reminded us of a truth history repeatedly demonstrates. Discovery alone changes very little. What matters is whether a society can turn discovery into permanence. The Norse found North America, but they could not make Vinland last, and because they couldn't, one of the most remarkable voyages in human history became little more than a legend, waiting a millennium for the world to believe it again.